Where I stumble and fall, but my strength comes not from man at all. Bound to stumble and fall, but my strength comes not from man at all. You believe, good. Am I hearing you? Am I seeing you? In late nights, in these nights, keep me right and bless me to the highest heights with young and go.
It's a number of infinity. One more than what you know how to be. And this is a light of festivity, when your broken heart yearns to be free.
Do you believe in miracles? Am I hearing you? Am I seeing you? Eight lights, and these rights keep me right. Bless me.
Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. That was the Maccabees singing their song, Miracle. We're in the a cappella days, these 9 days as we prepare for Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, this Sunday. We are in the period of the 3 weeks and now the 9 days leading up to Tisha B'Av. It's a time where we reduce our joy. That's why we don't listen to instrumental music. Try to make everything a little bit more subdued. And then on Sunday, we have a full 25-hour fast. We read the Book of Lamentations. Nina and I will have a public reading here on Facebook Live at noon Pacific on Sunday, our annual reading of the Book of Lamentations. It's also the day to cry out, a day to say, help us, God. The whole world needs a lot of help right now, and the more of us that cry out, the better. If you haven't signed up for our weekly email, you should be on that list. And then we sent out a page on our website where you can get a reminder on Sunday to cry out. Nina, I think is that also on our Facebook page? At any rate, you should sign up for our weekly email, and you can do that easily at accidentaltalmudist.org if you haven't done it already. Today's class is dedicated, a beautiful dedication by Lynn Job of North Texas. She's here on our show every day, beautiful contributor, and she's dedicating today's class during the 3 weeks, and now during the 9 days as well, honoring the present-day Levites, working so devotedly to teach Torah to all nations in this generation. Blessings in this work to the accidental Talmudist and to all who help and aid with gratitude to our Creator. Amen. Lynn, thank you for your sponsorship, and may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And as much as we're in a low point now, so may we come out the other side to a time of tremendous light and joy. There's a story told about Tisha B'Av that when Napoleon was in power, and by the way, we shouldn't forget, there's a lot of colorful stories about Napoleon. He's an interesting guy. He was a character in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. But let us not forget that what he represented in the world at the time that he was in power was tyranny. Okay, his empire was a tyranny, and there were a lot of problems with Napoleonic France. And so even though, there was actually a spot in his heart for the Jews, in some sense, not all Jews felt that way, but a lot of Jews did. And, we are grateful anytime, that we find relative peace in the world. Let us not shine too bright a light on Napoleon himself. Nevertheless, the story is told that one time Napoleon was walking through Paris, and he heard weeping coming from inside a synagogue that he was walking by. And he asked his aide to find out what was going on. The man came back quickly and said, "Those are Jews, Your Highness, Your Imperial Majesty, and they are weeping for the destruction of their temple." And Napoleon said, "What? What do you mean their temple was destroyed? Why wasn't I told of this? When did it happen? Where did it happen?" And his aide de camp said they're weeping for their temple that was destroyed 2,000 years ago. And Napoleon quipped on the spot, any nation that is weeping 2,000 years after the destruction of their holy building will merit to see it rebuilt. So take that as you will, but do we merit? Does this generation merit to see it rebuilt? It'll be rebuilt when the Messiah comes. Do we merit to see it rebuilt? Rabbi Avraham Twersky says about this. From the book of Lamentations 4:22, the punishment of your iniquity is complete, O daughter of Zion. He will no longer send you into exile. And Rabbi Twersky comments on this verse, for whatever faults we had, for whatever sins we have committed, we have been sufficiently chastened. If we have offended God with our vanity, we have learned humility. The calamities that have befallen our people have taught us humility. We have reached our rock bottom. A person who has hit bottom often perceives with greater clarity the beauty of what he had once and then lost. And he yearns with greater intensity to return to that level. And so the prophet tells us the punishment of your iniquity is complete. We are deserving of redemption, and we are more than ready for the return of the divine presence among us. And Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of modern Israel, said, where'd it go? Here, no. Yeah, the great Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, said, if we were destroyed and the world with us due to baseless hatred, and it doesn't mean that the earth was blown up, obviously we're all here. Nevertheless, there's so much trouble and grief and pain and sorrows in the world, and perhaps there wouldn't be if we, the whole world, and the Jewish people in particular, merited to have the temple in our midst, meaning a place where the divine presence would be manifest. If we were destroyed and the whole world with us due to baseless hatred, sinas chinam, right? So our sages teach that it was the second temple was destroyed due to baseless hatred among the Jewish people for ourselves. Then, says Rav Kook, we shall rebuild ourselves and the world along with us with baseless love. Baseless love, right? Don't feel that the only people that you should love are the people who deserve your love. Try to put out baseless love, says Rav Kook. All right, let's get to today's daf. We are on page 8 of Tractate Sukkah. This is the 7th volume of the Talmud. We are studying the laws of sukkahs, the fall festival. There are 5 chapters. We're in the first chapter. This is all about the sukkah itself. Today we'll complete our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1. The A side. Yes, dear. Oh, thank you very much. Let's light up the darkness. And I didn't welcome people either, did I? Okay. Who is with us as we do a little learning on a Thursday night, getting ready for Shabbos during the 9 days? Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, James in Indianapolis, Renee in Indiana, John in Sedona, Paul in the Great Northwest, PK in Colorado, Tom in PA, Michelle in Southern Indiana, Christo in Lubbock, Bill in Missouri, Patricia, Shalom. Nina put the link so that you can get a reminder to cry out on Sunday. Leslie, silly question. What are the candle and the bell for? Now you know. Very good. And Tom, nice comment. Tisha B'Av ends with joy and comfort. We wear talit and tefillin at mincha, what we normally do in the morning, the prayer shawl and wrap tefillin. We would do them in the morning service on weekdays. On Tisha B'Av, we do it late in the day. So we kind of ease the morning practices of Tisha B'Av later in the day. And Bill says, to be fair, most of the problems with Napoleonic France were that Napoleon was unwilling to settle for just France. you are more of a student of history than I am, Bill. So I'm going to let you have the last word on that. Okay, and a lot of other people are here. Fantastic. Okay, so the side, wait a minute, and over there on the YouTube side, Lynn, you're here from North Texas. I'm glad. So in case you missed it, we read your dedication today, and thank you for sponsoring today's class. Okay, the A side of page 8, so I'm not gonna go into it today. It's not for everybody. If you're into algebra, geometry, trigonometry, page 8a, Tractate Sukkah is for you. A lot of people in our audience maybe are not so into mathematics, but the bottom line is they're talking about what's the minimum requirements of a circle-shaped sukkah, which is allowable. And we know that for a normal sort of square-shaped sukkah, we have a minimum measure. And so how do we apply that to a circular sukkah? And Rabbi Yochanan would say that the sukkah has to be able to hold at least 24 people in it. That's a little different than the square-shaped sukkah. And then they get into a long discussion of how does the circular sukkah compare to the square sukkah? Should the circle fit inside the circle, or should the square fit inside the circle, or should the circle fit inside the square? And then they get into the mathematics of that, how a diameter compares to a circumference, which comes up actually quite a bit in the Talmud. So the sages did not know the number pi, right? 3.14159, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. An irrational number that keeps on and goes into infinity, number of decimal places. But it's approximately 3. It's a little bit more than 3, and the sages knew that the circumference of a circle is a little bit more than 3 times the diameter. And so they spend quite a bit of time on the A side of page 8 discussing how the circular sukkah, the area of it, the circumference of it, compares to a rectangular sukkah. We're going to move on to the B side of page 8. It's not a long page, so today's show is going to be relatively short. If you've got questions or comments, get them in there. All right. So Rabbi Levi said in the name of Rabbi Meir, with regard to 2 craftsmen's booths, one within the other, what is he talking about? So it was a typical kind of setup in Talmudic times that a potter, right, one who makes pots, would build 2 booths, an inner one used as living quarters and an outer one for plying his craft and selling his wares. And the inner one is not fit for the fulfillment of the mitzvah of sukkah, right? So we've already seen when we were talking yesterday that you could take an alleyway who has 2 parallel walls, and then with certain adjustments, but the main thing is putting the roofing over it, the schach, that will will have more shade than light. You can turn an alleyway into a sukkah. And so then we started to talk about, well, structures that already exist, or like the corner posts around a well on the pilgrimage road to Jerusalem when pilgrims would come up for the pilgrimage festivals. That could be turned into a sukkah. Such a structure was not built to be a sukkah. It was built to satisfy certain requirements of Shabbos. But if you then added the roofing, it could serve as a sukkah. So apropos that conversation, now we're talking about, okay, so if a potter has a situation where he builds a booth and he lives in it, and then there's an outer booth attached to it, which is like his store, right? It's the place where he fashions his pots and sells them to the public. The one that he lives in, because it's his permanent residence, cannot serve as his sukkah. So then the question becomes, because it's his permanent residence, so what about that outer booth, which is normally his store, right? The place where he makes the pots and sells them. Could he turn that into a sukkah? So Rabbi Levi said in the name of Rabbi Meir, with regard to these craftsmen's booths, one within the other, the inner one is not fit for fulfillment of the mitzvah of sukkah, since the potter resides there year-round, and it is not evident during the festival that he is residing there for the sake of the mitzvah of sukkah. So part of the reasoning for this is that he has to not only be fulfilling the commandment of sukkah, but he has to, have the appearance of fulfilling that obligation. right? If all he needed to do was to take the booth that he lives in all year and kind of change the roofing around, other people would look at him and say, hey, that guy's not fulfilling his obligation. And lest he, kind of attract the evil eye of his neighbors, the sages are going to protect him from that. Okay, so what does he need to do? And since it is a permanent residence, so still talking about the inner booth, since it is a permanent residence, it is also obligated in the mitzvah of mezuzah. Like any home that a Jew lives in, you have to have a mezuzah on the door, on the main gateway to the home, and all the doorposts in the house that don't lead to bathrooms and closets. But all the doorways that you pass through and into bedrooms, etc., need a mezuzah. But the primary mezuzah is sort of like on the front door, right? The front door mezuzah. And this guy's inner booth that he lives in is obligated in mezuzah. All right, it's obligated in mezuzah. And the outer booth, the one that's his store and study, as it were, his workshop, and the outer booth is fit for the fulfillment of the obligation of Sukkah. Just get this on my stand here. Of Sukkah. Since he does not reside there year-round, since he lives in his inner booth, he can use his outer booth to fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah. And when he resides there during the festival, it is evident that he is doing so for the sake of the mitzvah, since it is not designated as a year-round residence, but rather serves as an entrance to his residence and a passage for merchants and merchandise. It is not considered a residence, and it is not obligated in the mitzvah of mezuzah. Now that's a little strange, right? Because we have a mezuzah on our driveway because it has a gate over the driveway. So just the fact that it's an extension of the house, you'd think, well, if it's a gateway, it should have a mezuzah. What the sages are saying here is the reason that his outer booth doesn't require a mezuzah is because his inner booth, it's going to require the mezuzah by rabbinic decree because he does live there. But presumably it's smaller than what would normally be a house, or there's other problems with it that you wouldn't normally call it a permanent residence. It is a permanent residence because he lives there, but it otherwise doesn't fulfill the requirements of a permanent residence, and therefore his outer booth is not going to be obligated in mezuzah since his inner booth is barely obligated in mezuzah. And since it's not obligated in mezuzah and it is not his permanent residence, therefore he could use it as his sukkah during the festival of Sukkot. So the Gemara asks, why is the outer booth exempt from the mitzvah of mezuzah? Let the outer booth be considered like a gatehouse of the inner booth, and therefore be obligated in the mitzvah of mezuzah. And the Gemara answers, it is exempt because even the inner booth is not a permanent residence. It requires a mezuzah because the potter resides there year-round. However, that alone does not render it a full-fledged residence that would obligate one to affix the mezuzah to the outer booth as its gatehouse. So the sages taught. The booths represented, so now they're going to give other examples. This was the example of a potter and his inner-outer booth where he lives and where he works. So now they're going to talk about other people who have booths and ask the question, can those be used as a sukkah? All right, so the booths that are represented by these owners, and there's going to be a mnemonic, right? Because remember that this is the oral law, which wasn't written down for a long time. And even when it was written down, most people couldn't afford a written copy. So this was memorized, right? The entire Talmud was memorized by the people who studied it for, centuries. And to help them remember, so there's a mnemonic, Gimel Nun Beis Kaf. Right? So these are 4 Hebrew letters, which stands for Goyim, Nashim, Behema, and Kutim, meaning the booths of Gentiles, women, domesticated animals, and a booth of Samaritans, plus a booth of any sort, each is fit for use as a sukkah, provided it is roofed in the standard sense. None of them is disqualified due to the one who constructed it or the purpose for which it was constructed. So what these groups of people have in common, right? So the booth of Gentiles, meaning non-Jews, who are obviously not obligated in Sukkah, We discussed earlier that women can say a blessing when they have a meal in a sukkah, but they are not obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah because it is a time-bound positive commandment. So women are not obligated. A booth of domesticated animals, I guess like a booth that you're actually going to house animals in. Obviously, animals are not obligated. And a booth of Samaritans. So the Samaritans, the Kutim, were this group of people we've discussed before who sort of took on many of the practices of Judaism, but were not wholehearted about becoming Jews. They questioned the authority of the rabbis. They didn't believe in the oral law and the oral tradition. And so the sages did not consider them Jews, and therefore they're not obligated in the commandment of Sukkah. So if these people, any of the people in this group, or whoever built the booth that the animals are housed in, they did not, none of them are obligated the animals are not obligated. So these other people are not obligated in Sukkah. So a booth that was built for some other purpose, having nothing to do with sukkahs, by people who are not even obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah. So assume like a non-Jew built that booth for the animals. So can we use that booth to fulfill a Jew's obligation to dwell in a sukkah? And the answer is yes, provided that it is roofed in the standard sense, meaning that you will add schach over the top in the same way that you would add the schach, the roofing, to any sukkah. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the term in the standard sense? And Rav Kook said that it means, and provided that one established the booth to provide shade of a sukkah from its roofing, it may be used to fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah. And the Gemara asks, well, what does the phrase a booth of any sort come to include? Right? It seems like you gave 4 specific categories. Why now did they add a booth of any sort? So what does a booth of any sort come to include? So what other booths are included in this generalization? And the Gemara answers, it comes to include the booths listed in another baraisa with another mnemonic to help you remember these categories. This one is Reish Kuf Beis Shin. The Hebrew letters Reish Kuf Beis Shin. And what does this stand for? Ro'im, Kayatzim, Burganin, and Shomrei Peirot. Meaning, these are the boots that are, what? The boots of shepherds, the boots of fig-driers, the boots of guards of fields, and the boots of the guards of produce. So now these are presumably boots that are built by Jewish men who are obligated in the mitzvah of Sukkah, but they didn't build the booth to be a sukkah, right? They needed the booth for their work. Who is this? These are shepherds, right? So a shepherd might be far afield, far from home with his herds as he goes, takes the herds way abroad looking for food for them. And where is he going to spend the night? So he might build himself a little temporary hut to keep the cold out. He didn't build it as a sukkah. Can it be used as a sukkah? Yes, it can, if it has the correct roofing. Likewise, people drying figs, they build booths for that kind of work. The guards of fields, right? So this was in ancient times. Very often, all the people would live in a walled town where it was safe, and their fields would be out surrounding the town, and they would only go out there to do the work, and then they would return to the walled city at night. But at times, like when, near the harvest, when the fields were filled with produce to prevent theft, they would have guards out there living in the fields, and there were no houses out there, so they would build these temporary huts for that purpose. Could they be used as a sukkah? Yes, if they added the correct roofing, and likewise the guards of produce. So a booth of any sort is fit, provided it's roofed in the standard sense. So the Gemara asks again, what is the meaning of the term in the standard sense? And Rav Kook said that it means, and provided that one established the booth to provide the shade of a sukkah. Then it can be used for the mitzvah of sukkah. And the Gemara asks, what does the phrase a booth of any sort come to include? And the Gemara answers, it comes to include the boots listed in the first baraisa with the mnemonic Gimel Nun Beis Kaf. So now it seems like those 2 baraisas are referencing each other, and they are referencing each other. But why there are 2 different baraisas, and one seems to say well, these Jews who built a booth not for a sukkah purpose, they can all be used as a sukkah, as well as any other booths, that any other sort of booth, and it refers to the first list of booths built by non-Jews or Jewish women who are not obligated, people who are not obligated. And then in the other baraisa, they give that list first, and they say, and a booth of any other sort. And what's implied by that other list of booths that were built by Jews, but not to fulfill their sukkah obligation, if they put the right roofing on it, they could use it. And so why are there these two different lists that each list seems to prioritize one of those lists and make the other list secondary? That's what the Gemara is wondering now. So this Tana, this rabbi of the Mishnah, who taught and detailed the law of that first list, did it that way because the commandment of sukkah is powerful and more obvious to him in those cases because they are permanent structures, even though their builders are not obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah. And then he's taught booths of any other sort to include the ones that are temporary structures built by Jews who would otherwise be obligated in sukkah. And the rabbi of the Mishnah who created the other list, for him, he prioritized these structures that were built by people who are obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah, even though what they were building was temporary structures for another purpose. And then for him, he added on, and you should also know that these people who weren't obligated in sukkah, their permanent structures can work this way as well. That's it. That finishes page 8 on the B side. With God's help, tomorrow, Friday, noon Pacific, is our normal time. We'll be starting the new Mishnah number 2 of chapter 1. Let's check to see if you have comments or questions here on Sukkah, page 8. Sharon, I remain puzzled by the idea that Sukkah is time-bound. We sleep and eat routinely, and we are to dwell in the sukkah all day and all night. Other than candle lighting, which is a woman's mitzvah, and ritual prayers in synagogue, what is time-bound about Sukkot? The mitzvah of lulav and etrog seem to me to be more of a time-bound mitzvah. It's so interesting, right? Because so Sharon is saying, like, well, since the mitzvah is to dwell in it all 8 days, right? And not, ideally you take your meals there and sleep there. So is it really time bound? It seems like an all-day mitzvah. It's a great question. There's going to be a more detailed discussion of who is obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah and who isn't a little bit later in the tractate. But sometimes these laws are not so penetrable to understand. So I did look it up. And I think what shows, Sharon, that your question is really a good one, is that while all the streams of Judaism agree that the sukkah is a time-bound positive mitzvah, and therefore women are not obligated in it, there's this big division between Ashkenaz and Sephardic whether a woman who does take her meal in the sukkah can say a blessing over it or not. Right? And Ashkenazi women do. And they say, say the blessing, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to dwell in the sukkah. Right? And Sephardic women don't say that blessing because the holding from Maimonides is that women are not commanded, so they shouldn't say that they're commanded. Why do Ashkenazic women say the blessing with the approval of all the rabbis over the last 1,000 years? Because the Jewish people are commanded. Nevertheless, the fact is, we don't say blessings over things that we're not specifically commanded to do in general, but there it is, kind of a gray area, a little bit type of case. And so for further discussion and questions about this, definitely you can Google this question and find out more than I'm capable of giving over today. Paula. If those who live in the house are of mixed faiths, Gentile and Jew, would they have a mezuzah? I am thinking no. And Nina answered that if a Jew is living there should be a mezuzah, even if it's a mixed group. That is my understanding. If a Jew lives somewhere, there should be a mezuzah on that house, even if he has non-Jewish roommates, right? Because it doesn't matter who else lives there, right? You could have tenants, you could have workmen that work there, If the Jew lives there, it requires, right? And it doesn't matter if he's the owner or not. If you live there, even if you're a renter, that dwelling needs a mezuzah. So I don't see why the fact that even if there's two of you, one is Jewish and one is not, and it's kind of 50-50, nevertheless, and even if I think if you had three non-Jewish roommates and you're the sole Jew, I think you still would have a mezuzah on that dwelling, if that's your permanent dwelling. Check with the rabbi, but I'm about 99% sure of that. Okay, that's it. Short class today. That's all I've got. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, again, noon Pacific. Even though we're decreasing our joy all week as we get ready for Tisha B'Av on Sunday, tomorrow's Erev Shabbos, we're getting ready for Shabbos, and always it's appropriate to increase our joy as we head into Shabbos. And even though we don't eat meat during these 9 days because we decrease our joy, and sages elsewhere say there is no joy without meat, and so we don't have meat during the 9 days, for Shabbos we do. Right? So we haven't had any meat this week, but we could have some for dinner tomorrow night. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers, and God willing, we'll be together again tomorrow. Take care.